Mr. President, atmospheric carbon dioxide just hit new records in our atmosphere, the highest in the history of humankind. And I rise for the 260th time to call this chamber to wake up. As we venture further into uncharted, dangerous climate change, the National Council for Science and the Environment issued this report, Climate Science Research in the United States and U.S. Territories. This report surveys climate research papers from public universities across all of our 50 states, every single one of them, to highlight the breadth and the depth of climate science coming out of our state universities and to showcase the climate science centers and institutes that they host. Some colleagues pay no attention to the threat of climate change, but their home state universities sure do. 10,000 peer-reviewed research papers published out of 80 universities from 2014 through 2018. That's on average 185 peer-reviewed articles published on climate change in each state. The report says this: in every state, public universities invest in scholarship and education to advanced fields such as climate modeling, climate impacts, adaptation, and more. Increasingly, they go on, climate science has been integrated into coursework on sustainability, energy, engineering, architecture, business, and even political science. One wonders what is the hold the fossil fuel industry has over the Republican Party that causes colleagues to ignore the research from their home state universities. The report continues. Climate scientists are studying a wide diversity of topics. They're measuring carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. They're studying carbon cycling and the impacts of a changing carbon cycle. They're studying the impacts of climate change on the nation's food security, crop yields, heat stress, health impacts, soil erosion, on water resources, including water quality, balance, river basins, drought, precipitation, mountain snowpack, on impacts to critical infrastructure such as sea level rise on coasts and on subtropical islands, to the impact of permafrost thaw on subarctic rivers. Finally, researchers are also studying the social science of climate change, including changing attitudes, polarization, opinions, beliefs, and their impacts on framing in the media and on decision-making. Region by region, in every state, the report shows our state universities tracking climate change's consequences in fine detail. Quoting from the report, in the Midwest, agriculture is a major focal area for climate-related research, with more occurrences of the word agriculture in climate-related papers from the Midwest between 2014 and 2018 than in any other region. In the Southwest, a key focus of scientific research in the Southwest region is on the impacts to people and ecosystems from heat, drought, wildfires, and flooding, end quote. In the Southeast, the impacts of climate change in the Southeast are becoming most visible through the increase in flooding, temporal and geographic shifts that affect human health, and growing risks of wildfires, end quote. In the southern Great Plains states, scientists in the southern Great Plains are studying climate impacts on food systems, sea level rise, as well as impacts to unique ecosystems in this region, such as the tall grass prairie in Oklahoma. Across all these regions, red and purple state universities are churning out climate research. In fact, conservative states' universities are home to some of the most prolific climate science departments and institutes. I wish they were listened to by our members here. Texas A&M University, the alma mater of climate change denying former Energy Secretary Rick Perry, produced 256 papers covering topics like shifting summer monsoons in the Lone Star State, local surface temperature increases, atmospheric changes, and climate adaptation strategies. North Carolina State University produced 223 climate papers examining climate change and atmospheric chemistry, surface ozone, regional water research and precipitation, and it's home to the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, which helps coastal North Carolina grapple with rising sea levels, erosion, and flooding. Go to Idaho. Researchers from Boise State and the University of Idaho issued 164 climate science papers covering threats like wildfires, bark beetles, shifting precipitation, rising temperatures, and disruption to ecosystems in national parks like Yellowstone. Idaho also has 2 academic centers focused on climate change: the Hazard and Climate Resiliency Consortium and the Center for Resilient Communities. For the staff at these 2 centers, it's all climate all the time. For the Idaho delegation, it's never climate, ever. Let's look at what's happening in the home state universities of Republican senators on our Environment Public Works Committee. Here's what they'll find in their university backyards. The University of Wyoming produced 124 climate change papers on wildfires, endangered species, Yellowstone National Park, and other climate topics. 124. The university is home to both the State Climatology Office and an atmospheric science department, which does modeling and empirical climate research. Its faculty are working on subjects like, and I'm quoting the report here, the role of climate change and variability on vegetation and fire, using modern climate analogs to understand past environmental disturbances, developing web-based animated maps of climate, and development of 3D climate visualization tools to enhance learning approaches in the classroom. I wonder if our Wyoming delegation has visualized that. The University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University published 183 climate change papers on things like southern plains grassland, rising temperatures, soil respiration, and much more. OU is home to the Oklahoma University Climate Science Center and the Department of the Interior's South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. Here's what the dean of University of Oklahoma's College of Atmospheric and Geographic Sciences has said. I quote him here. On the increasing strength of Earth sciences, we can now state that global warming is unequivocal. He has said, the fact that the planet's warming and the fact that CO2's a greenhouse gas, and the fact that it's increasing in the atmosphere and that it increases in the atmosphere due to humans, about those things, there's no debate. I'm not sure the Oklahoma delegation here has taken that in yet. West Virginia and Marshall universities have turned out dozens of climate change papers on precipitation, drought, tree growth, and much more. The West Virginia Mountaineers have a mountain hydrology laboratory, which reports on climate changes, and I quote here, important implications for management of freshwater resources, which include, and I quote again, the Highlands region in the central Appalachian Mountains is expected to wet up as warmer air carrying more moisture leads to what they call intensification of the water cycle, what you and I would call worse flooding. The laboratory warns, and I quote them here, that the implications of this intensification are immense. The University of Arkansas contributed 51 papers and hosts the University of Arkansas Resiliency Center. Arkansas researchers warn of the need to reduce greenhouse gases, particularly including carbon dioxide and methane, because these gases, and I quote them here, absorption of solar radiation is responsible for the greenhouse effect, end quote. The university describes the greenhouse effect thus, I quote again, these gases are trapped and held in the Earth's atmosphere, gradually increasing the temperature of the Earth's surface and air in the lower atmosphere, end quote. A University of Arkansas scientist predicts that the spread of plant species in nearly half the world's land areas could be affected by global warming by the end of the century. And yet, what do we hear from Arkansas about climate change? Alaska actually gets its own regional chapter in this report. In Alaska, and I quote, "Researchers at public institutions are studying changes in the marine environment and the impacts to the valuable marine resources Alaskan communities depend on." End quote. There are papers on thawing permafrost and its effects on water quality, infrastructure, and habitat for fish and wildlife. There is research on what rapid ocean acidification, rising sea levels, and shifting fish stocks mean for Alaska's coastal communities. And there's research into challenges facing Alaska's indigenous peoples fighting to protect their ancient way of life in a rapidly changing landscape. Alaska is home to not one, not two, but three climate institutes: the Alaska Climate Research Center, the Alaska Climate Adaptation Resource Center, and the Ocean Acidification Research Center. Alaskan researchers have written papers titled "Permafrost is Warming at a Global Scale" and "Climate Change and Future Wildfire in the Western United States." The Alaska researchers don't mince words. I quote, "Projections of warming suggest that considerable change will occur to key snow parameters, possibly contributing to extensive infrastructure damage from thawing permafrost, an increased frequency of rain-on-snow events, and reduced soil recharge in the spring due to shallow end-of-winter snowpack." Not hard to understand, but where's the action? In the Dakotas, North Dakota State and the University of North Dakota are studying the effects of climate change on the Great Plains, the Mississippi River, land use and adaptation, and public policy. They're also home to North Dakota's Agricultural Experiment Center, the Global Institute of Food Security and International Agriculture, and the Center for Regional Climate Studies. South Dakota State has issued dozens of studies on climate change, including what it will mean for the state's groundwater supply, maize and wheat crops, and precipitation levels. Heading south, the University of Mississippi and Mississippi State are studying what climate change will mean for sediment flows, droughts, watersheds, and water quality. They're looking at what climate change will mean for Mississippi's vitally important rice crop, a crop that supports hundreds of rice farms in the state. And they do good coastal climate work with the Sea Grant program. Auburn, the University of Alabama Tuscaloosa, and the University of Alabama Huntsville produced 140 climate papers that are in the Council's study here. You'd never know that from the Alabama delegation. Auburn has an International Center for Climate and Global Change Research, and University of Alabama does climate change research at its Earth System Science Center. Iowa State, all by itself, is responsible for 117 papers on climate change, on agriculture, corn, grazing lands, yields, on weather, precipitation, droughts, temperature, even on beliefs and behavior related to climate change. Last but certainly not least among EPW Republican states is Indiana, home to two world-class universities doing extremely impressive work on climate change. Indiana University and Purdue combine for 289 papers. They're also home to the Center for the Study of Global Change at Indiana University and Purdue's Climate Change Research Center. Now, I hope it goes without saying that universities who study climate change and who publish scientific papers on climate change also teach climate change in their coursework. Maybe we should spend a week here in the Senate getting a refresher on the home state climate change science. It might do us some good. But we don't. We waste week after week here as the danger looms, the warnings pile up, and the research keeps coming about climate change in our home states. We, Mr. President, will be the most clearly warned body in history of disaster ahead, and yet we still sit here doing nothing. Never has a political body been more clearly warned of a more present looming disaster than this one, and yet still nothing. The Council's report on state university climate research has these web diagrams which show how climate change research focuses more on climate effects as they begin to manifest themselves in the state, not just predictions and science any longer. Now it's measurement of actual events. But the diagrams also show the various areas of research about which these research papers are being published. So here's the web diagram for the topics that are addressed in climate science research in the southwestern universities. The 12 universities in Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah in this study show real-time effects of climate change like drought and wildfire, and point to direct links between tree mortality, drought, and climate. We in this country depend on the Southwest for more than half of our specialty crops, vegetables, fruits, and nuts, so we got to pay attention when drought threatens all of those. Here's another one, another topic web for the Southeast, highlighting that the university's research has been on sea level rise, on ocean acidification, on adaptation, and on management. Now, here's a slightly different web. This web is not a web of science and inquiry. Nope. This is the web of front groups and dark money organizations that the fossil fuel industry has supported, created, and used for decades to sow false doubt about all of this science from all of our 50 states. Their job is to lie about this science, and they've done it well. They have used this same web to deploy political muscle and propaganda to block action here in Congress. That's why, with all of this research being done in all of these states, nothing is happening on this floor. Nothing has happened since Citizens United gave the fossil fuel industry the equivalent of howitzers, whereas before then they just had muskets. I remember how bipartisan it was here, Mr. President. You weren't here then. Between 2007, when I was sworn in, all of 2007, 2008, and 2009, we had 5 different bipartisan climate bills popping up around on the Senate floor. 5 of them. All strong, serious bills, not little nibbly things just to make people feel better. Real bills. January 2010 comes Citizens United. The fossil fuel industry gets its brand new hardware, its political howitzers, and they go straight to the other side of the aisle and say, anybody crosses us is dead. And bipartisanship died that January on climate change. And it's only beginning to resurge now. But the decade that we lost will have cost us a lot. And it makes the urgency of what we have to do now all the more important. This web of denial, paid for by the fossil fuel industry, has stymied Congress for a decade. And I hope I don't need to remind anyone here that the fossil fuel industry has a conflict of interest as to this question. Indeed, the International Monetary Fund has quantified it as a $650 billion a year conflict of interest. For $650 billion in conflict of interest, you can pay for a lot of nonsense organizations that are phony front groups to put out your poison and your political propaganda and your political pressure. Is it not time, at last, that senators paid attention to the trusted science actually happening in their own home state universities and not to this corrupt web of denial that's propped up by the conflicted fossil fuel industry? This web of denial has done nothing but lie over and over again. They're provably wrong over and over again. The things they say are false over and over again, and yet the industry behind them still controls the United States Senate, and we can't budge despite the rest of the world moving on dealing with this issue. Let me close with an anniversary that we mark this week. 10 years ago, this Friday, a full-page ad ran in the New York Times. A full-page ad pointing out that the science of climate change was already, by then, 10 years ago, to use the word in the advertisement, scientifically irrefutable. The science is scientifically irrefutable. And it goes on to say that the consequences of climate change would be catastrophic and irreversible. Wow. The science irrefutable, the consequences catastrophic and irreversible. Who could have signed this ad? I'll tell you who signed this ad. Donald J. Trump and his children. Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, Ivanka Trump, and the Trump Organization. Right there. 10 years ago Friday, that's what the Trumps had to say about this. I conclude by saying to my colleagues, the science is there for you to see. You don't have to go far. Just go to your home state university. It's right there waiting for you. For the truth of climate change, just turn to the researchers teaching your students in your state's own universities. They can tell you, just as Donald Trump and his family did 10 years ago, that what we face is irrefutable and that its consequences will be catastrophic and irreversible if we keep monkeying around and failing to act. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.